Hello Internet, my name is Zero, and welcome back to Geek Out. So, you know how last week I said I was doing something different? Well, this week we're doing something different too. I'm enjoying just geeking out about whatever hits my brain, so I hope you're enjoying it too. This week, and last week, a cute animated show called Miraculous Ladybug has been releasing a bunch of new episodes. You may be a giant fan of it, or perhaps it's not your thing, but either way, there's plenty to geek out about here. And the biggest thing that stuck out to me when I first started watching Miraculous was the dynamic animation that really caught my attention. With those two things in mind, this week we're going to be exploring the principles of animation with Miraculous Ladybug. Now, let me just preface, this is not going to be an in-depth teaching video. It's more of an exploration of the animation concepts to either get your feet wet in the animation scene or to enjoy and geek out. Even if you don't know this stuff, you'll probably have a good time. I will probably go over the basic idea of each principle, but the best detailed video of animation principles is already on YouTube, made by someone else, so I'll just go ahead and link to that in the description below, so you can check that out afterwards if you're interested in learning more. Well, with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. So the first principle of animation that I want to talk about is called squash and stretch. The idea that objects or characters will elongate or flatten to push or sell the animation. So, for example, this sequence is one of my favorites to explore that sort of idea. What you'll notice in this sequence, as he runs forward, he crouches down and kind of squashes into the floor, right? All of this is smushing, right? He's got this great downward motion happening here. And then in the next frame, it's really obvious right here. He stretches. Look at this leg. They've literally stretched his legs out. His legs are not this long. In order to have that squash, right? That downward motion, and then the stretch of him pouncing to the side. In this whole sequence, you can kind of sense that squash and stretch that's happening. Every time that he hits the ground or comes back up again, that he has that squash and stretch repeatedly used. Okay. The next one that I want to talk about is called anticipation. So basically what anticipation is the character pose prior to a large action that gives the audience a hint of what's about to occur. They do this a lot in Miraculous, which is really cool. So for example, in this sequence, which you can already see that squash and stretch that we just talked about in a minute with this arm right here, but we're on anticipation. As she swings back, notice that she holds this pose for a very long time. During this sequence, she winds up and lets it go. There's the real action that's happening is her throwing the yo-yo, but the wind up for the yo-yo is nice and long. Here, we'll watch the sequence from the top. See how she holds that pose back here? Notice that the other poses are blurry because they're moving so quickly, but this one can even settle because she holds this anticipation of her throwing her yo-yo for such a long time. Great example of anticipation. The next principle is called staging. I've been using the term framing, but that's more of a storyboarding term, but in animation it's called staging. So it's the presentation of a story moment or an idea. For example, in this sequence, the superhero power-up sequence, you'll notice that they bring the camera in to all of the movements that are important. So for example, the necklace glowing, the mask, the hand, the whole body, the ears, tail, and magic pose. This moment is staged very well to be able to focus on what is important, just like I said. First we have the necklace, then we have the mask, which not only do they use light, but they also zoom in on the part that's important. The hand, which starts the whole outfit coming down from hand to feet. Then we have the zoom in and the light used for the ears, the light and camera position for the tail. Plus her eye is even looking at it too. Everything is kind of pointing in this direction. Great use of staging. Next principle that I wanted to talk about is called pose-to-pose animation. Basically where artists create main poses or positions for the character to take that you can easily kind of spot. I talk about poses a lot and then I realized last week that I probably haven't explained what poses are. So it's a position that the character holds. For example, in this sequence, Cat Noir will take different poses. So the first pose is this shrug and eye lock with the character that he's talking to. The next pose is looking down, shoulders settled with kind of this sagging head. And then the next pose is him shifting his gaze straight down. I wanted to use this sequence because it's really obvious to see those 3 poses because they're held for so long. You can use this same idea for action sequences as well. It can be used for big moments or little moments. I like the fact that this animation relies pretty heavily on pose-to-pose animation, kind of like anime does, where there will be clean, clear poses that the character will move between throughout the sequence. The next animation fundamental is called follow-through and overlapping. So that's basically the idea of other objects dragging behind the main force of the motion, such as a feathered hat or a cape. For example, I love this sequence. This is probably one of my favorite little animated moments, is because you can watch the follow through and overlap that happens on Cat Noir's ears. You see that? We'll slow it down a little bit. As he comes down, his ears go up, right? They're following the action, so they're dragging behind his body as he comes into the frame. Then as he settles, you'll notice the ears go down and then up. They have that bounce to them, that sense of gravity. The action catching up, the ears hitting their lowest point before they spring backwards. Those little actions that happen that react to the main force of motion is when you see those little details such as animating the ears individually. The next one is called slow in and slow out. Basically, all movement has a rhythm to it. Every action doesn't get the same amount of time, or as we call it, frames of animation. So movement should build up and settle, not move all at the same pace. So for example, he gets hit by the wind, and this movement builds upon itself. It slowly starts moving him backwards, and then as it picks up speed, he falls backwards faster and faster. Because slow in and slow out principle is being observed, an action should build up, not move always at the same pace. The next animation principle is called arcs. So it's basically the circular path that is created by movement, especially large movements with characters. So for example, when Cat Noir backflips out of this room, you'll notice that his legs create an arc. So as he moves, this leg will come up and around. See this arc that has been created by his leg kicking up and around. You'll notice if we track the other leg, it will follow an arc as well as his hands, his head, the whole thing. Especially large movements can be followed by a circular path or a curving path. This next principle, some would say that it's the same as follow through and overlap, but the founding fathers of Disney's animation style would beg to differ. It depends on basically who you ask. Secondary action. It's defined as another essence that is added to push the character. So, for example, in this sequence, I'm not sure this is a perfect example of secondary action, but the animation done on Cat Noir's tail is sort of an example of secondary action, where it helps define the character that adds to the essence of who he is. You could also say that the ears are as well, because they add to the character. Secondary action, I've always thought of as being very much the same as follow through and overlap, but there's room to differ. So, for example, watching the tail respond to his movements, it doesn't follow the movements absolutely perfectly. It adds a little bit of flavor text to what's happening here by it curling up and around in a way that cats' tails do, more than just following through and overlapping. The next principle is called timing. So the emotion or true nature of an action isn't just defined by the action itself, but by how the poses are timed together to complete it. We've talked a lot about timing before when it comes to storyboards and how long an action will take, and how that has an impact on the emotional feeling that the audience gets from it. This show definitely has a great way of using timing with a lot of their big animated sequences. So for example, in this fight scene, Ladybug is going up against a bunch of different enemies, and they use impact of timing to help really push the emotion of the action. So we have this setup of them all shooting at her. Follow Cat Noir in as he goes to attack. That movement is close in on framing. We're talking about timing here, but it zooms in very close in order to set up that framing. But you'll notice the timing speeds up too. She kicks, and then slowed timing for impact. The response, and the slow-mo again. 1, 2, everything is coming together, and completely slowed down. And the time and the spacing at the end gives her room to breathe and whistle and kind of be a little bit snarky with the fact that everything was so intense just 10 seconds ago. That sense of timing really helps build our excitement for it and then release that excitement when she has everything under control. Next is exaggeration. So taking the pose or action from a sequence and pushing it for clarity of emotion. So if someone is excited, you can push the silhouette and overall feel of the pose to sell that emotion. So for example, you can also use exaggeration to showcase who a character is based on the poses that you use. So in this sequence, the akumatized bad guy is in love with Marinette, and so he's offering her a note, and he could just come over and hand it to her, right? Or he could do the cat noir thing if you've watched Miraculous and come over and bow and give it to her gracefully. However, notice the use of exaggeration in this sequence. Did you catch it? The timing for it for you to notice it in this sequence, which is why I picked it. This is a very over-exaggerated pose for him to come into a bow, right? This over-exaggerated pose really sells the emotion that even though this is a villain, he's being very cute, very sincere, very innocent. The next principle mainly pertains to 2D animation. It's called solid drawing. It talks about keeping forms consistent across different angles of drawing a character. However, in 3D, I personally like to think of it as clarity of animation. By that I mean, whatever you're animating needs to be clear to the audience. And in 3D, it's easy to create an animation that looks great and clear from one angle, but because of the nature of a 3D object, does not look the same from a different camera angle. So keeping that in mind in 3D, in my opinion, is something that can be very tricky and another principle to keep in mind. There's 3 things that are happening in this sequence. The policeman in the background, there's Chloe and her father celebrating in the midground, and there's Cat Noir in the foreground. At the same time, there's 2 competing emotions that happen in this sequence. The excitement and the celebration versus the wow and the love that's happening from Cat Noir. They've done a great job as far as framing as well as keeping the motion that happens here, because you have already something happening in the foreground and you have something happening in the background, it would be really easy to muck it all up and for it not to be clear to the audience what's happening. Because of that, keeping this solid drawing principle in mind in 3D, they have this animation happen moving this 3/4 direction, so that way this posing of what they are doing doesn't get lost with the busyness that's happening in the other parts of the frame. You notice that? Everything happens in this 3/4 view direction to keep that clarity in a scene that is already very full of other objects. So again, that's my own personal take on it from a 3D perspective. You're free to think of it however you will. This show is just dripping with the last principle, which is appeal. Appeal is a little bit more of a nebulous concept, the idea being that the characters and their movements should be likable. The characters and actions you create should be pleasing to look at. The way they move should match the way they look. So the superheroes in this show have very fluid moments, Cat Noir having the most cat-like and smooth demeanor, with more of a focus on sword fighting. From all the clips we've been through, and especially if you love the show yourself, you can see that this show has quite a lot of appeal. So for example, even him getting into position has a good sense of appeal. You'll notice though, in this sequence, we can almost put all of these concepts together really quick. So let's execute every single one of these principles in one sequence. So the first one, squash and stretch. You can honestly already start to see that when he backflips, as he is stretching back into the frame and his legs stretching and then squashing as he lands and takes the brunt of that motion into his chest, and the stretch that's still happening through his arms. Alright, squash and stretch. Done. Anticipation. You can feel the anticipation when he holds this pose before the final pose of being aggressive, right? This is a great anticipatory squished pose that we hold on before it moves completely through to the final pose, which is the large action. All right, anticipation, done. Staging. The fun thing about this sequence is the staging. We don't know who's behind him, just as he doesn't know who's behind him. And then as the camera backs out and settles with his final pose, we get the silhouette of Ladybug and we hear her voice to know that this is an ally. By using this camera trick, we are unsure if it's a villain as much as Cat Noir is. Staging. Done. Pose-to-pose animation. I think you guys can catch some of the poses in this sequence already, but we'll go through it really quick. So the first pose, Cat Noir is looking down into the elevator shaft. Next pose, He hears something, right? It's just a turn of the head, but it's still a pose. You could call this anticipation again. So he's reaching forward before he throws himself backwards. And the next pose being his backflip backwards, right? Just as we talked about. You're starting to see the pose to poses. So I'll just play this part really slow and you can see the poses in action. All right, pose to pose animation. Check. Next. Follow through and overlap. This is a great one in this sequence, as any sequence that have Cat Noir's hair or ears in it will have this sort of essence. You can see that follow through and overlap really obvious with his hair in this sequence. Watch how it bounces forward and then settles back from his big action. Next, slow in, slow out. But the beginning starts rather slow and then speeds up into the anticipation and then the final reaction, right? So we have the beginning, speed up, slow, fast. You can feel that sort of movement and rhythm that's happening of going in and out of the poses, taking up different amounts of time. Next, arcs. You can see the arcs with the backflip in of itself. It's a perfect arc there. That's an easy one. One arc that maybe is a little bit more challenging to see, unless we go frame for frame, is his arms. I just started going through this sequence, tracking both of the hands, and you can see here that both of his hands in 3 dimensions have their own arcs to them. So arcs are everywhere. They're hidden all the time. Keep your eye out for them next time. All right, arcs, done. Next, secondary action. So there's not a whole lot of secondary action happening here. I think the biggest showcase of secondary action, if you don't want to use the other definition of it being the same as follow through and overlap, would probably be his tail popping into position here, as it gives a little bit of impact, and then the tail following through as he spins his hips sideways. So in its own way, secondary action, done. Timing. While this one definitely has its own sense of timing. Fast. And then that timing of that head pop is probably my favorite example of timing. The aggressive face to the settle for just a second into the pop of surprise. All right, next. Exaggeration. Well, I think this whole sequence is a bit of an exaggeration. The ridiculous antics of him spinning everything around him and his body squashing and stretching. For the sake of clarity, there is a lot of exaggeration happening in this. When he's spinning the baton in these different crazy poses, they do exaggerate how low he bows down in order to spin it across his back and how high he spins it. This is a very good example of an exaggerated pose. This twirl in of itself is a giant exaggeration of a movement. All right, next. Solid drawing. So, the camera that's used for this sequence while he's spinning the baton follows him ever so slightly to keep that clarity in mind. And then, when he settles with the pose, the camera moves in order to explain that his aggression is ill-met. It's an ally who's behind him. And that use of clarity for the camera following him ever so slightly helps this feel very clear. And the last thing is appeal. And honestly, how can you not think that this animation is not super appealing? And those are some of my favorite animated moments from the show. I hope you enjoyed seeing these moments and explaining a little bit of how this show showcases the principles of animation exceedingly well. Comment your favorite animated moments below from Miraculous or from any animated show that you really enjoy that you think showcases these fundamentals of animation. Hopefully you enjoyed this deep dive into animation fundamentals with a dash of my geeking out along the way too. Thanks for joining me this week, and I'll see you guys on the flip side.